to understand what's at stake, right? According to the Natural Resources Defense Council, up to 40% of the food in the United States is never eaten.
That's right.
So households toss lean vegetables. People are confused about food data labels, whether it's expired by, good by what day. It's very confusing to consumers. And the restaurants often serve massive portion of, and then trash the leftovers. And grocery stores, right, overstock their shelves to maintain an image of abundance. Farmers are unable to sell produce that doesn't look perfect, to your earlier point. We need a perfect apple, right, in the supermarket. And at the same time, 1 out of 8 Americans struggle to put food on the table. So Google co-founder Larry Page once said, people are starving in the world not because we don't have enough food. It's because we're not yet organized to solve that problem. So Emily, can we solve the problem? And what can industry and the company do about it?
I'll be very, very humble. This is not me being pessimistic. I don't think we can solve the problem entirely, but we can make it much better. How about that? Mm-hmm. So as you pointed out, there's this great dichotomy, right? For those of you who said 40% of food in the United States is wasted, you win. Well done. And at the same time, we have somewhere between 10 and 20% food insecurity, depending on where you're in this country. Total mismatch, right? How is this possible? And then for me, it actually starts by leading at Google. And the part that I'm very excited about is our founder, Larry Page, knew this a long time ago. He, as Helen had noted, hunger is not the result of not having enough food. It's a distribution problem, right? It's actually connecting that food to people when they need it. So in as much as I work a lot with industry partners, whether that's Kroger or Albertsons or Compass Group, the largest food service company in the world, we got to start with ourselves, right? We got to make sure that we're doing the right things. Otherwise, it would seem very hypocritical, honestly. And so a lot of the food waste sort of analysis and understanding in Google's own operations has been ongoing for almost a decade. So we started in 2014 measuring our own food waste and really working with a company called LeanPath. We had a LeanPath machine and a dashboard in the back of every kitchen. So we would very, very thoughtfully measure any trim waste and any excess overproduction at the end of every day, so that at least what you measure is what you're going to work on, right? If you don't measure it, you don't know, right? And so over those years, we made a lot of progress. So between 2014 and 2022, 8 years, we saved over 10 million pounds of food by doing things like minimizing how much we were overproducing when we knew that, for example, cooking enough eggs for 500 people didn't make sense. We're only going to cook enough for 250 and then cook more if needed, right? And then other things this sounds really silly, but the way you trim a strawberry matters, right? Most of this, I didn't know this. It was a long time ago. I go in there and I take the strawberry and I just cut off the top and then get rid of the leafy bits, right? The really good chefs will go in and actually cone out the strawberry, because if you do that with 10,000 strawberries, that's a lot of strawberries that you're throwing out, right? So even just culinary efforts to reduce our food waste, our trim waste, were underway. So we ended up in March of this year actually stepping up even further as a company. We're a global company. We're in 56 countries. We have 170 cities in the portfolio. We said, you know what, given the Sustainable Development Goals 12.3 around reducing food waste by 50% by 2030, we are going to publicly commit to 2 goals, because we believe it's actually our moral responsibility to do so. And as a result of publicly committing to these goals, we will then also inspire our food service partners and our suppliers upstream and downstream to do the same. And so a lot of them have been actually ahead of us. So Compass Group had food waste goals since 2017. And, we were kind of dragging our feet a little bit about being more public about our work. So the 2 goals that we've decided are actually really important. And you're like, why can't food waste be a single goal? It's actually twofold because of how the food supply chain works. So goal number 1 is to reduce our food waste by 50% per Googler, per individual staff member by 2025. That's a simple one, just reducing it, right? So how do we work across the supply chain with our users in every single node to reduce? The second one is a little bit more, I'd say, unknown or sometimes misunderstood, right? It's not okay just to reduce the food waste. It actually matters where the food waste goes. Any remaining food waste, if it ends up in landfill, is going to be 20 times worse than any other place it lands, right? So what happens is when food waste, because it's organic content, ends up in landfill, and if it undergoes anaerobic digestion, it produces methane gas. Methane gas is 20 times worse than carbon dioxide for the environment. And so we want to avoid sending anything to landfill. So the first one is a reduction goal. The second goal is a diversion goal. By 2025, we will divert 100% of any remaining food waste away from landfill. Compost is fine. Anaerobic digestion is fine. Like, we want to turn to energy. We can, and even better if we can move it to people who can eat it, or we can turn it into animal feed. So any option other than landfill is very important if we're really thinking through the climate impacts of this. I want to go back to 10 million for a second. So I know a lot of people are like, 10 million pounds of food, hard to imagine how much food that is. It's a lot of money, right? So, the way the Feeding America and other organizations calculate it is for every pound of food, it's about $1.50, right? So you can think of that as like we just tossed $15 million into the trash can, right? Then there's the environmental impact. 10 million pounds of food is equivalent to 25,000 metric carbon tons. And so then you're like, okay, what is 25,000 like carbon tons, right? That is equivalent to 5,000 cars driving on the streets constantly for a year, right? It's like, just like 5,000 cars just fuming carbon dioxide. It is also equivalent to over 1 billion gallons of water. 1 billion gallons of water. You're like, what does it mean by 1 billion gallons of water? Imagine if every single person in the top 5 cities in the United States all took a bath at the same time. That's how much of 1 billion gallons of water. You combine New York, like the Bay Area, Chicago, Houston, I don't remember Los Angeles. Mm-hmm. Everyone who lived in those cities took a bath at the same time. That's 1 billion gallons of water. Mm-hmm. So the impact of waste is really significant. There's a materiality to not just food waste, but any waste. So I find it super interesting when we talk about carbon, like that, sometimes we don't tie it back to materiality. And I think food waste is fascinating and a really valuable area to work in. Again, going back to opportunity, right? Like if Helen and I were working on a, injection molding like lineup, right? Like we're probably cutting out most of the waste already, right? We've probably figured out how to like return any scrap plastic back into the system.
It's like 60% yield. It's not acceptable in our world. We're aiming for like a 99.9%, if not 100%, right? We want like zero waste, So, but when it comes to food, I guess, to your point, if you cannot measure it, right? If people don't understand what that really means, it doesn't really going to impact them a lot, So that's very, very interesting. I like all the examples that you've given us because it gave us a very clear picture in terms of how bad the problem is, how big the opportunity is, right? On the other hand. So according to U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, right, 10% of the nation's greenhouse gas emission come from agriculture. So if you're thinking about it, you waste anything, right, from seed to table, you also, right, contributing to make the problem even worse. According to the food system, America throws out more than 400 pounds of food per person per year. 400 pounds. Can you imagine that? And when that food is wasted, so are the resources that goes into producing it, right? Including 21% of fresh water used by the U.S. agriculture industry. And wasted food also generate climate change pollution equivalent to 37 million cars per year. So if we could redirect just 1/3 of the food that we now toss to people in need, it would be more than enough to cover unmet food needs across the country.
That's right.
So Emily, I wonder, Google is a technology company, and I know you're also trying to utilizing technology to solve the problem. Could you give us some examples in terms of what that could look like?
Yeah, absolutely. So, we've looked, again, very humbly up and down the entire stack when it comes to tech. In the early days, a lot of two examples of the work that we were doing when I was at Google X included using computer vision to really try to identify what was going into our compost bins so that you can take, by the way, most of the staff members in the kitchens work like a really long shift. And then so by the end of the day to manually enter information is like a lot of work. And so like, again, being very user-centered, like how can we take this task off of their hands? How can we use what we know about artificial intelligence to simply identify? That's possible, but that doesn't actually fully close the loop. The second thing we were looking at is how do we better match supply and demand, right? And the food industry is so interesting to me because when I go back to some of the most difficult computer science problems that we're looking to solve for, there's the traveling salesman problem. In what order do you pick things up and drop things off? And then there's the knapsack problem is if you're trying to dig out $5.23 from your backpack and it's just full of coins, like you could do that in many different combinations. And that's about how do you fill a truck with all of these different boxes and items in the most efficient manner. At the end of the day, I'll be really honest. After doing a lot of work in the space, meeting with dozens and dozens of more other companies that are doing this work, we actually stepped back and stepped back again. Step back number one was we said, wow, you know what? Lots of different players in this world are already operating and working together. Our role maybe should be simply making that information visible, right? Meaning that's very good to say that. Right? Like if there's surplus food, how can we immediately make it seen on the internet so that many different players can come and basically say, hey, I'm going to take this, or like, hey, I don't need it right now. Hey, second group, third group, fourth group, fifth priority can go and take this surplus food. Then we realize actually, it's not even making it visible. It literally is going down to what I think is assembly code. It's like having common standards of even how to describe our food doesn't exist. So remember like 25 years ago, HTML didn't exist. Okay, maybe 30 years ago, HTML didn't exist. The internet couldn't actually work together. And then a large group of folks from many different parts of the world came together and said, let's figure out a markup language that we can all agree on. And then that will allow for the interconnectivity of all of our different sites and information being shared. And that flourished. Same thing with, the Android operating system, right? Like, but we come together and have an open alliance around how we want to label things, how we want to describe things. That starts to unlock everybody's resources and cycles, right? And so in terms of tech at this point, my team is very much spending a lot of time on understanding what are the open source standards and tools that need to be in place to enable the hundreds of thousands of organizations that are doing food recovery and hunger relief to really work together and communicate together and play their role much more effectively. And so tech can come in many ways, right? It can be very fancy, computer vision, AI, ML, but it can also be down at the assembly code level. We want to step in and help in the right ways with the ecosystem to really help it thrive.
It sounds like the data might be out there, but they're not organized. They're not consistent. There's no standard, right? So it makes like more advanced technology like machine learning so much more difficult because we haven't really organized it. So this actually reminded me about what Larry said again, because we're not organized to solve this problem. So the step one might be how can we organize ourselves, in a way that data actually become high quality and meaningful, right? That can be actually utilized to solve the problem. That's very interesting. So as a tradition of our program, I hope to build an intellectual bridge between the current and the future generations. Einstein said, any intelligent fool can make things bigger and more complex. It takes a touch of genius and a lot of courage to move in the opposite direction. So Emily, how would you paint a picture of sustainable food supply chain by giving it a new perspective?
This is credit to Andrew Zimmern, who is an incredible chef and writer and anthropologist in his own way. He described the food supply chain and the food system as a Mobius strip. And so if you don't know what a Mobius strip is, you can cut a piece of paper and then flip one side and then tape it together. So regardless of where you start, even though it twists and turns, you'll always end up back in the same place, even though it's a very complex strip of paper. And so the reason why I love that analogy so much for the food supply chain is because you can start in food waste and then you can end up going back upstream into upcycled foods and what suppliers are doing in processing plants and farmers. And then, you could start with farmers and you could end up in a completely different part of the supply chain trying to understand labor and immigration. And then if you start with immigration and labor, you might end up actually coming back around and looking at food insecurity, because it turns out that a lot of, actually it's ironic, but like a lot of the folks who are essential to our food system running are also food insecure, because they might grow a lot of food, but all the food leaves and then they're stuck with a food swamp where only fast food is accessible to them. So when I think about the food supply chain and the complexities of the food system, the Mobius strip really sticks with me as the analogy.
Wow, that reminded me about circle of life.
Yes.
Right? Yeah. I like to encourage your audience to start asking questions. Okay, we will start picking up the question. We have a few minutes, reserved for that. So Emily, giving you that homework, actually come up with an analogy, which I give to every guest speakers, and I also come up with one. Here comes my analogy. Everyone is worried about 8.3% inflation rate, which is at 40-year high. But have you ever thought of the 40% of wasted food? It is equivalent to 5 times the worst inflation rate. As consumers, you can do nothing about inflation, but you can help reduce food waste and save yourself 40 cents of every dollar spent on food.
I love it. I love it so much.
I just thought that everybody, complaining about inflation rate, really thinking about every dollar you spend on food, you actually waste 40%. So 40 cents, you throw it to trash can. Well, you literally do that if you have 40 cents in your hand. And by the way, $1, you cannot really buy that much, right? Let's say $100. Can you just literally throw $40 to the trash can?
It's crazy.
Yeah, so,
Helen, I have one more thing to share then.
yeah.
I want to share a link for those of you who are looking to make the most of your food at home. My very, very good friend, Michael Kahn, who is the head of culinary development for Google, a month ago shared a number of recipes, what he does with leftovers, or sometimes you're like, what do I do with the extra rinds of the watermelon? You can actually eat the watermelon rind if you pickle it in the right way. So he shared a few of his favorite recipes there. And so I hope that helps, especially, when you're at home in your kitchens thinking through what's in my refrigerator today, what can I do with it?
We have an interesting question also about the maybe potential for blockchain technology. Do you have anything to comment on that?
That's a wonderful question. Blockchain has been around for quite some time, and I believe in 2017, IBM did a lot of work with various organizations to try to get more information onto a food supply blockchain. And I remember Frank Yanis, who was the former VP at Walmart responsible for food safety, and then currently I believe he's at the FDA overseeing food safety. It does have a big impact. So he used to say, if there was a recall, right? Let's say, I don't know if you remember this, a couple of years ago, there was a big recall on lettuce, from Mexico. And then what happened was they had to shut down the lettuce imports from Mexico for like a week. That meant $40 million worth of lettuce went to waste because they couldn't pinpoint where the issue was, right? Where the E. coli, it was an E. coli outbreak. Blockchain helped to reduce that time significantly to figure out which, at least, city it was in, so they didn't have to shut down an entire country's worth of imports. And so there's absolute value in the blockchain reducing food waste. And in my mind, it's mainly upstream. It's mainly upstream disruptions, right? So from supplier to potentially processor to consumer, right? But less so blockchain for consumer downstream.
Yeah. Emily, I want to give you time to share your final thoughts on one thing that you'd like our audience to remember.
Oh gosh, thank you, Helen. You're all incredibly lucky to have Helen as a professor. She is encouraging you to exercise agency and to practice stepping up where you can and when you can, whether that's in your personal life, in your professional life, as a community member, whether that's in your city, in your state, or in the nation. And I encourage you to take full opportunity of that. I think each and every one of us has the opportunity, but sometimes we don't step up because we're worried about what other people will think, worried about what our bosses might think. And the way we learn is by trying. And Helen is creating an environment and the sandbox for you to do that. So I hope you consider that, whether it's on this topic or any other topic that she shared with you in the last 8 episodes.
Oh, that's a surprise. I did not expect that, Emily, on this topic. Thank you so much for your kind words. I agree with you. I think everyone else can do more. So I want our audience to remember that the largest source of food waste is people in their own homes. So we waste more than a grocery store, restaurants, and any other single part of the supply chain. And everybody can be the change agent to solve the food waste problem. So Emily, thank you so much for your leadership, your passion, your tireless efforts, and inspiration in solving the food waste and food insecurity problems. And I hope our conversation leads to many more discussion about a sustainable food supply chain, whether in the corporate boardroom or at the dinner table with every generation. And thank you everyone for attending our live webinar and listening to our podcast. Thank you. Thank you, Emily.